Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. We've got a really exciting topic. We've got two really great guests, and so we will get started at this moment. So let's start by way of introduction. My name is Oliver Way. I lead the product marketing function here at JumpCloud, and with me are two esteemed guests. So let's start with Chris. Do a quick introduction on yourself, and then we'll pass it over to Fred.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm the author of Startup Secure, Baking Cybersecurity into Your Company from Founding to Exit. At my day job, I'm the CISO at Crossbeam.
Awesome. And Fred?
My name is Fred Wilmot. I'm the CISO at JumpCloud, and I do a bunch of other things in conjunction with the security community around things like DEF CON and some of the village work there and B-sides.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you guys for both joining us on the panel. I'm really excited to have a conversation with both of you. Typically, right, like the folks with the shortest intros in these type of sessions are usually the ones that know the most. And so I'm really excited to kind of pick your brains a little bit on Zero Trust. But before we get started, let's do two quick housekeeping items. I know most of the folks here might know JumpCloud, but if you don't know JumpCloud, we're basically an all-inclusive platform that incorporates directory identity access, device management, things of that sort. If you are curious about what we do, and if you're not familiar, just go to jumpcloud.com and you can find out more about us. The second thing that we'll quickly talk about it is that we are giving out Chris's book for 50 of the attendees here. So all you have to do is to fill out the survey at the either at the midpoint or at the end of this session, and we will send you a book with, where applicable. There's some fine prints in terms of how we can send it to you or different locations but please put your information in, and then where we can we'll send you a book. And I'll also toss it over to Chris for a few seconds to talk about what the book is about in the first place.
Yeah, so the purpose of the book, I wrote it for founders and folks not in cybersecurity on how to start and apply cybersecurity in their organization. The kind of catalyst was I read a lot of books for founders on how to build a startup, how to build product. Not a single one I could find mentioned cybersecurity, so I felt it was a topic that needed to be in the hands of the folks building these companies. Tools that we're using every day, whether it's at work or in our personal lives. And also just to share and mention, I am actually donating 100% of my first year proceeds to Homes for Our Troops. They're a post 9/11 organization that builds homes for disabled veterans. So going to a good place if you already bought a copy of the book.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. Right, I think that's super helpful. There's so many content about starting companies, but security is always baked in at the end, and so the ability to kind of build it in early in the phase will probably save a lot of headache downstream. So let's get to our topic, right? So today we're going to talk about the practicalities of Zero Trust. I thought that with the panelists here, we will spend just a few minutes on just level setting on what Zero Trust actually is. And for some of you guys on the phone, you might already know what Zero Trust concepts are, but I figured we'll spend sort of 5 minutes with Chris and Fred just to get their thoughts on Zero Trust, how they define it, and sort of the way they look at it. So let's start with you, Chris. Right, like you're the guest, and how do you define Zero Trust? Right, like there's, depending on who you ask, depending on which vendor you talk to, is it a technology, is it a framework, is it a process? What is it?
Yeah, well, I can easily say it's not a product, one single product you buy. Definitely on the methodology and framework side, and really it's something IT folks have been doing for decades. Before cybersecurity even existed, right? Managing mainframes. Zero Trust is something we've been doing a very long time, and I really think it's just least privileges, right? We've always been doing that. We've always strived for that. whether you're in cybersecurity or IT. So yeah, more on the methodology side, less on just one product you buy and then you're done. So more of a journey, just like cybersecurity.
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? Like I forgot who I was talking to in the hall, well, actually not in the hallways, but virtually. But a lot of you guys are actually doing concept of least privileges, right? Like if you remember back in the day when we all used to go to offices, your badge didn't get you to all the rooms that are in the office, right? Like there are certain ones that IT rooms, for example, they would never let the marketing guy in because I had no business in there. And so you already kind of have a sense of that. And we'll talk about this a little later on in terms of how things that you're doing today already applies to zero trust. And so it's not a lift from nothing. Before we move on, I also want to kind of ask Fred a quick question about zero trust, right? Like there's a lot of talk about zero trust over the last couple of years. It's been more of a topic, in the industry as a whole. There is some question that is zero trust, is that like an official standard? Is it part of a standard? Talk to us a little bit about the zero trust within that context of sort of compliance frameworks or cybersecurity frameworks.
Yeah, I think we were just sort of talking about this a little bit ago and sort of making light, all things that are wonderful as a standard, take 5 to 10 years to become applicable for the rest of us. But there is a framework for architecture that NIST has put out, but I think we would all agree that understanding how to implement that would be something very specific and topical to each organization looking to do that. So I think there's a lot of statements around what the framework of zero trust could be, but to follow on what Chris is talking about, there's elements that we already see that we do, but become a lot more applicable when we think about, well, I can't trust everybody that's in my office now, right, via VPN, and so I have a different policy for them. It's a policy that I've got to set for every single person accessing every single resource, and so it becomes a little bit more like things that maybe historically we would think about in terms of accessing federal infrastructure or some of the requirements of DoD, right? But it's definitely been around a while. It's just now it's becoming super topical for sure.
Awesome. So, all right, with that, let's get into the meat of zero trust. But before I do that, so I wanted to remind everybody who's on the call, we want this to be very conversational. And so if you have questions, about a particular topic, something that we said, you want additional clarifications, feel free to put it into the chat window in there. We'll answer them as they come in. And so when you get a chance, if you have questions or just anything, put it in the chat window and we'll get to them as the conversation goes. So let's start with you, Fred, on zero trust. There's a lot of talk about zero trust, and especially it seems like this is particularly applicable now that we're in the world of remote work. And with this year 2022, seems like, well, at least prior to Omicron, that folks are starting to move back into the office. And so it generally seems that in today's remote and potentially and probably hybrid type of work environments, this becomes a concept that's important. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that means for organizations? Why zero trust as a framework is something that we should all consider, or the practicalities of why that's important for an organization.
So it's a good question. I think there's a handful of things that become more interesting now. Not only do you go through the digital transformation that's been happening for the last handful of years, you also sort of have a convergence with things like, okay, COVID / work from home / work from anywhere, that sort of moves around all of the organic components of what you have for a subject, a predicate, and object when you think about an access control model or something like this. I need to get to my mail. My mail server is no longer hosted in the office, right? Maybe it's O365, or I need to get access to this particular compute infrastructure. Well, that lives in AWS, okay? Or I have this specific application that I run, somewhere else that my company has licensed, and I have a method for doing that. So when we think about some of those constructs, what we used to suggest is those maybe weren't different before, but they're different now because now we don't have a way to think about trusting a network component that we have a trusted network to provide, or a trusted identity in the sense that maybe it's a specific user or a system access that was available in this way. And then maybe it's, something that we should consider around the devices we use to access things from. That used to be something important to us too, but now it's become very relevant. So when we think about some of those components, I think each of those in ways people deal with today, right? VPNs are not new. And when we think about what does it mean to have a secure system, well, people have understood this problem, and there's been CIS benchmarks, for quite some time now, for us to understand the complexities of how to harden an operating system to be successful in defending most of the hygiene type of vulnerabilities and risks we have there. And then there's also, how do we understand the data infrastructure or the systems that people are accessing as a function of that? And that gets back to the access control point that Chris made first. And I think that's probably the topical place for us to talk about where that becomes the interesting moment of between, working in Starbucks, working in your hotel room, working in, in your office space as sort of like I'm here, I'm on premise or not, but I might also be hybrid, but I might not be me, right? And justification of how to validate those things.
Awesome. And so that's a great point. And so kind of passing it over to you, Chris. There's a lot of good things that Zero Trust incorporates, right, with today's environment. It also sounds like, after a year and a half, 2 years with COVID and remote work, that companies are already kind of doing zero trust like types of activity already. Can you talk to folks about that? Just some of the things that they're doing that already kind of sit into the realms and what they might need to continue to improve upon as they go through this journey.
Yeah, so I really liked your analogy earlier about badge access, right? A lot of us are in companies that have transitioned from having an in-presence office where my control, my zero trust control was you have a badge, you swipe the badge, you're into the building, you're into the office, and that's where your computer stays, right? Maybe you don't take it home every day, or maybe you have another step. Okay, so your badge was stolen. How do I really know that person with that badge is you? Right? Just because you swipe doesn't mean you are you, right? The person holding the badge. Maybe there's a PIN you have to enter, right? Depending how secure your facility is. Maybe you work with the DoD or something. So I think that's a really easy way for most folks to understand what does zero trust mean, and how does it apply to different systems, different access. Now we've lost that, right? I can't verify you're in your home, right? Or you're at Starbucks or coffee shop nearby. So now what do I have to rely on? Your login, right? Your username and password. Okay, you should be the only one with your password, but if we look at password spraying attacks and password reuse, not everyone is using password managers yet. So now how do I verify what was your badge to get in the office, and now is your username and password to get into our corporate environment? That's where you see now the advent, which many years ago, multi-factor authentication. So now you get maybe a prompt on your phone or an email with a one-time passcode. So hopefully you're the only one in possession of your phone to give a little more trust in you are who you say you are when you're logging into the environment. You can take that a step further. Now applying controls to the endpoint, where that's kind of your last position of defense is, okay, is this device that this user is using to log into our environment, is this a known device? Is it authorized? You see new things coming up in VPN and CASB solutions where you're looking at the makeup of that system, right? Is there a cryptographic match, right? Are you using some type of key on the system to authenticate? Does it have your MDM installed? Does it have your antivirus installed or whatever endpoint protection product you're using? So that's where you start applying that zero trust principle, least privilege principle to a device and not the person, right? So you keep going down the line and go all the way down to the data layer, which is the concept I talk about a lot in the book. Is, you start with the advantage you have over the attackers, which should be your data, right? The thing that they're going to go after. You know your environment best. What is it that's valuable to an attacker in your environment? Start there and work your way out. So hopefully that's an easier way to wrap your head around like what is a very, I think, nebulous topic that gets thrown around a lot in marketing or even, us as cybersecurity professionals, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And oh, sorry, Fred, you were going to say something.
No, completely agree. Great analogy. The other thing I was gonna also offer is, I think Chris made a really good point here. One of the important parts of understanding system and user is those combined things of system and user, right? And one of the questions I think people often ask is, when we talk about access control and identity, right? Is my identity the same strength? If it's just me logging into a public workstation, if it's me logging into my laptop, if it's me logging into my iOS device or my Android device, and then is there this multi-factor, and what are the strengths of multi-factor, right? Biometrics or what have you, to determine whether or not this is me, right? The authenticity of the authorization, right, in that sense. And there's something really a lot more relevant now than once was, I think, about these particular elements. And like the badge reflection, this is the case. Like that is your badge. That is what you have, right? That is what you are. And this is the process of you going through that from an identity perspective. And it's relatable to the devices that you identify from. So a very good point, Chris. Thanks.
Awesome. Hey, so we got our first question, Fred, and we've spoken a little bit about zero trust within the confines of your organization, but there's also some sense, right, like the ability to or at least the need to guard against third party, fourth party risk, right, things like that. And so a question that came in from our audience is how does zero trust work with folks or organizations or contractors or things like that are outside of your organization where you may not have as strong of a control, say, as your employees?
Yeah, so I'm actually somewhat draconian about this. So if you want to have access to said infrastructure, then I'm going to have to treat you like an employee. So what does that mean, right? You're going to be provided credentials in the same way, accountability in the same way. In our case, right, you're going to be on whatever device it is that you choose, whether we provision it or it's yours. You will have a JumpCloud agent on it, and you will have policy audit around whatever device requirements we have. If it's a laptop, right, then you need to have EDR, as Chris brought up earlier, right? It's one of the things you check for, and make sure that you have things like your encryption and standard set of password policies. And oh, by the way, probably have your firewall turned on, right? These kinds of very simple things. But also there's the rest of the things, like you're not using malware or things that are outside of our acceptable use policy. So the long and short of it is, if you want to basically have the access of an employee at JumpCloud, you'll be treated as such, like an employee, which means you go through all the same things from a policy perspective. You're provisioned in the same way. Your revocation happens in the same way, and your credentials are all tied to one identity. And your system is a part of that. So that's how we do it. I recommend that's how we do it. But Chris probably has an opinion on this too. I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I really love this topic because I see it from both sides, right? If I was one of these vendors, would I want this random tool installed on my device, right? Now I've got to kind of go through the procurement process and do a review, if I have those mature processes in place for cybersecurity, not just from a technical standpoint, but from a contractual standpoint. So I think you've got a couple different options. I agree with Fred, right? It's either we'll provision you a device or we're going to have something installed on your device. Of course, there's always exceptions, right? Running a business is about taking risks. There is no such thing as no risk, and it's our job to help the organization take the right ones at the right time. So, in those exception cases where, okay, maybe they won't install anything, maybe they won't use one of our devices, maybe it's too costly to provision or something. What do you have to rely on, right? You're going right back to that initial login, username and password, some type of MFA, and then stronger monitoring of that activity in whatever system they're using, right? Whether it's compute resources in GCP or AWS, or managing a database for you, something like that. Putting those wrappers around, like I'm sure everyone on this call has heard, cybersecurity is layers, right? And it all comes back to those layers, and applying zero trust at those layers as well, right? So let's say it's database access. You want to verify, okay, it is username and password, having things like MFA, time-bound things like, is this person in a specific geo where they're going to be doing their work from a different time zone than where your organization is located. So you really have to kind of go beyond just the easy fixes, right? And that's, I think, part of our job in the organization, where we've got to enable them, and maybe we have to take risks that we don't like that much. But at the end of the day, I think that's all about running a business, right?
Those are both great points. I think the other thing that a lot of practitioners forget also is doing the basics well, right? Like, so for example, if you have a third party, you have a contractor, they join your organization, as much as it's important to onboard them, you should also offboard them once they're done, right? From whatever system, from whatever tools. And so just like doing the basics, well, that kind of fits within that zero trust, sort of a mentality. And so that's another thing that we can think about. I'll switch gears a little bit, right? Like, and this is, I think, a little bit towards the implementation, side of things with the zero trust. Like, when organizations, I mean, here's another buzzword that people talk about, and it's all about, passwordless. Like, when we get to passwordless, what happens then? Does multi-factor fit in? If so, what does that really mean? Let's start with you, Chris, right? Like, what are your thoughts about passwordless within the context of zero trust, and if it actually changes anything?
I'm definitely very excited about it. I think it's going to be a significantly better user experience. I think what we've built over the decades in cybersecurity has not been so user focused, and really taking into account that a human is going to be using these systems at the end of the day. I think things change where, okay, now you just have a username, right? We're authenticating on different things on that device, right? So we already kind of see that on later model Apple MacBooks, right? You've got the Touch ID. That's how I log into my device 99% of the time, unless it's rebooted to apply a patch or something. That's passwordless right there, right? I don't think you can get any more basic. But now, because we're remote, I still have a username and password, right, to get into my email, to get to Google Drive or other systems. I think there's going to be more work that needs to go into identifying and trusting that device, right? So looking at a lot of other indicators of how you use the device, right? Behavioral things might be a little more complex for us as the defenders to use that system. But I think at the end of the day, it's really going to be a full industry effort. It's not going to be, there's a lot of products out there that sell this passwordless, but really to get there all the way to it, I think it's going to take, Apple, Microsoft, Google, Chromebooks, everyone's going to have to get on that bandwagon and remove username and passwords from their systems. But then how are you identifying, right? Is it with the camera? Are we doing biometrics? depending where you work, maybe you can't have a camera in your laptop. Maybe you work in the DoD. I don't know how many folks on the call work in a SCIF or have worked in a secure compartment and information facility. That's not going to fly there. So I think we're going to see new interesting challenges when it comes to passwordless. But I think in the long run, it's going to be a lot better for everyone, security in general.
Awesome. Yeah, and a lot of things are still the same, right? Like it's still one portion of zero trust is the authentication side, and what you do afterwards is similar. I think Fred, you also had a comment. Sorry, I think I cut you off there.
Yeah, no, it's so I think there's some concepts around how to establish an enclave, right? You know, today we have things like password managers, right? Where people, it's sort of an enclave in the sense where maybe you know, some places have a master password, maybe not awesome, but you know, basically what it means is that you can have some level of complexity for whatever the requirements are in the short term, rather than, you know, sort of defeat the purpose of the method of authenticity, right? And I think the trust model there is the interesting component that continues to change. And the more we start to tie and align things like devices with identity, then it becomes a lot more compelling to do exactly what Chris said, which is like, hey, you know, this is interesting. I haven't seen you authenticate from this particular device before, you know, and you're looking to access this particular resource. Let me step up the authentication requirements for you and really validate that it is you, right? Versus the notion of everything just being passwordless. I think the construct of being able to capture what is ease of use for people, and then also really sort of reduce as we begin to rely on more identity-based, you know, authentication, is to be able to reduce the level of fraud associated with such, because, you know, biometrics are not a panacea to, you know, to remediate that, as neither are, you know, MFA forms of authenticators or whatever the case may be, right? We have those challenges. So I think there's a set of parameters around sort of where we are now with the notion of password management, the notion of trust models that help us establish some brokered enclaves that allow us to step up or step down trust, given, you know, who an identity is. But we're a little bit out there from maybe purely passwordless everywhere. Like Chris said, I think there's an industry set of things that have to happen, adoption that has to happen before that can really be unified.
I just want to add on to the end there real quickly. I think there will always be resistance to this type of innovation. If anyone's familiar with large bank Charles Schwab, they put out something when you call, your voice is your password, so that's how you authenticate. You don't put in other information. I think that's really interesting. You know, being on the defender attacker side, like, oh, well, someone could record me saying that and play it back. But really, what is the risk? And I think at the end of the day, we need to make sure we're not, you know, slowing down innovation at the risk of some future vulnerability. There will always be vulnerabilities. That's just how it works, right? Humans are building all this. We're not perfect. So I think making sure we're pushing to get to passwordless, even though it might seem a little scary, like, well, how do you authenticate someone, right? Everything we just talked about. I think we have to remember that that's something we're always going to be solving is what's the next vulnerability, right? And really what the risk is.
Super good point.
That's a great point. Well, this is a a fantastic conversation so far. So let's get on to the next topic, right? Which is around what companies are doing today in the zero trust, right? And so I think that we can kind of combine this section in the next couple of sections, where the discussion here is really around what areas can organizations focus on, right? Like to kind of begin their journey, and as they mature parts of their infrastructure, what to think about and what to kind of see what comes next. So maybe we'll start with you, Chris, and let's start from the perspective of user and devices. And we talked a little bit about identity, we talked a little bit about access. Just sort of give us your perspective on that journey for zero trust, from the perspective of users and devices?
Yeah, so I think where someone could go and start right after this webinar, right, is going to your authentication system, whatever that directory service might be. If it's not turned on, turn on MFA, right? That's, I think, a first housekeeping step. It's gotten a lot better. Yes, there's 20 odd MFA apps you can install on your phone. I think I've got 7 or 8 on my own, but that's a really easy, quick step to say you are who you say you are, right? When it comes to networks, right? Another thing you can dial up there is the device itself, and I equate networks and devices now, since we're all remote, kind of in the same place, right? So what network are you coming from? Do you normally connect to our environment through Comcast or Cox Cable or whoever, or now you're suddenly in France, right? That's an indicator to do more authentication of that event. A lot of systems have these capabilities in place, regardless if you're on Google or Office 365. Yes, you might have to purchase a tool to get some of those features in place, especially on the device side. If you're, say, migrating from a legacy VPN to CASB or something like that. So I think those are really easy steps to turn on immediately in your environment that start you on that journey, right?
That makes sense. And Fred, so Chris talked a little bit about devices. He kind of touched on networks and potentially even in IaaS environments, workloads, right? Like that. There's also need to think about that journey. And so maybe comment a little bit about that part of zero trust and the networks and cloud infrastructure in general.
Yeah, so I think good feedback on, hey, locality matters, who you are matters, how we help characterize that matters to help determine, what you should have access from, and then what you have access to. And sort of relatable to that, typically one of the things to think about there is also how do we relate single sign-on? So how do we think about trust models for things like SAML assertions for cloud? I have a bunch of IAM policies in AWS. Okay, I have a lot, right? Most people have a lot, or they have overly prescribed things, or whatever the case may be. Some of the things that we think about here is, how do I tie that to a role? How do I make that focused on what this person's responsibility in the organization is? I think one of the things that's really, every time I have the good fortune of showing up at a new company to work on some new cool problems with people, I spend some time going through an access control matrix, right? What do people need to do their jobs? And fundamentally, we always, as humans, sort of get in this mind, should I have access to this thing or should I not? Let's not worry about that. Let's just capture where we are, right? And start from there. And we'll look for consistencies. The same way Chris talked about with respect to where you're coming from as to where you're going to. People that do this kind of work need to go these typical types of resources. We can very easily look at both flow data. So, here, anything that you look at in the cloud, for example, where you're looking at your VPC flow logs, or you're looking at and associating this with your CloudWatch and CloudTrail logs, give you a very clear indication of what people generally do and need to do their job. So you also have that level of orientation to be able to characterize those roles and push that to single sign-on to make it easy for people. I think that's a pretty critical element.
Awesome. So this is really a stimulating conversation, and we're starting to get questions in. So also just a reminder for folks that might have joined a little later, feel free to put questions into the chat window. We want this to make this as conversational, and we can wanted to answer as many as your question, not just the sort of the prepared remarks that we have. One came in on just from someone from basically an attendee who said that, hey, they're part of a startup, security in a startup, you're focusing on just kind of getting the product out the door. You're just trying to figure things out. Security is probably not something top of mind, and it's something where the people ask like how possible is it to incorporate sort of that security mindset, and how realistic is it to do so. So Chris, you wrote a book, right, on this very topic. I figured we'll start with you, given that you've seen both very large and very small companies, and so maybe some tips and tricks on what folks in very early stage startups can do.
Yeah, I think it is very achievable, very within reach, regardless of the size of the organization, whether it's you as the first security hire or you as the founder, right? So something Fred just mentioned was taking stock, right? You really need to understand first before you implement anything, make changes, is really understanding the environment. What is it that you need to focus your personal time and limited time on in that organization, right? So one of the first things that give a great concrete example here, maybe it'll resonate with folks. So when I joined Crossbeam, had a couple of months of conversations, but I didn't know all the technical ins and outs of, okay, where do I need to apply security first? At limited time, limited budget, what do I need to focus on first? Start from the inside, right? Our data, right? Our customer data, where does that live? I need to know where it is, right? Where in AWS? Is it just in RDS database? Are there snapshots? And then who has access to that, right? Layering on, we've mentioned multiple times, multi-factor, turn that on in AWS, easy win right there. Most engineers are familiar with it, so shouldn't be a lot of friction. But I really needed to know, yes, the person running this command is that person, right? So we put together, again, this is part of being in engineering and being in cybersecurity. Not all systems just plug into each other. So looking at the user activity on their device that we know is their device, that's managed in our MDM and has our security stack installed. Are those commands matching up with what we're seeing in our CloudTrail logs, right? Did that command for dumping an entire Postgres database, did that actually show up in our environment, right? Sounds a little complex, yes, but that is the concept of zero trust. So we've authenticated the person, right? But just because you've got MFA, there obviously or most people know about the flaws in SMS. There's vulnerabilities there. It's not completely secure. So if that is an option, I still want to know that command actually came from that user's device. But then going another step, okay, is their device compromised, right? Did that person actually run that command? So looking at window information, what process ran that command? Was it from the CLI? Was it from some weird child process that spawned out of Chrome? Something like that, right? And that goes to having tooling in place like a endpoint protection product or endpoint detection response product where you get that telemetry and you can match it up with the existing telemetry in your cloud environment. So there's a lot of steps you can take. That was my first step, is where's our data? That's the most important thing we're focusing on. And then I can work my way out from
there. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, like even from a non-security perspective, like understanding where your data is, what your spends are, actually is beneficial for a startup too, in terms of are we using the resources, the most efficient. And so that's I think that actually gets us to the next question, and then we'll ask you, Fred, right? Like there's a lot of things that you can do, and sort of I think that the last question kind of hints at that how do you get the organization on board with, say, a zero trust or even just a general cybersecurity journey, right? Like there's a tendency for organizations, especially in startups or early stage companies or even like mid stage companies, to not focus on security because it's always perceived to be slowing things down. And so the question, for you, Fred, is like how do you gain consensus? What do you need to do to talk to leadership? And how can we kind of guide our listeners or our webinar listeners today on how to begin that journey?
Well, the focus is on the business, right? And so security is a method for doing business securely, or, if we want to do work remotely, we want to do work remotely and securely in this concept. So, some of the things to think about here is, first of all, a lot of the cultural indoctrination, it's not just viewed. There are several types of things in security that do actually slow things down, right? So, being mindful about what those things are and when you do them at a startup is pretty essential. The business has to be able to operate. That's the fundamental, aspect here. Just like a service must be available before it can be, really you worry about the security of a thing, because there are many other things that can make it unavailable, or whatever the case may be, because of stability or the way that we wrote the code, or so on and so forth. So the way that I would think about it is, we have some values here at JumpCloud: 1% better every day, right? And that's the way to think about this. You really are trying to boil the frog here. The way that you help facilitate that is by really indoctrinating people with guardrails and tools that they can utilize to do their job better, right? So when we think about zero trust, some of that can be make it easy to connect me to the resources I need, right? Make it transparent to me to understand that I don't have to know everything that's on my laptop, right? But it's got to function and operate effectively. And in doing so, means that I can connect to and communicate with all of the infrastructure I need, workloads, compute, all the things in the cloud, sure. But it also means that when I'm doing my development work in my testing environment, my staging environment, I can do the same thing. And fundamentally, velocity is a big indicator when you're early days at a startup. And some of those things are really critical, especially when you have I have a demo for somebody, tomorrow. I'm at the VC's office. I can't get access to the Wi-Fi, dot, dot, dot. There are n number of things that become potentially complex if you don't have means around them. And so, MFA, MFA, MFA. But we also have identity, and you have a device. And so now we have a way for us to open this path for you and guardrails to do so, right? Granted, you need to meet some of these requirements, but if you do that incrementally and you don't make people crawl over glass just to implement security, good things happen. Good things happen.
Awesome. Yeah, it sounds like, based on what you said, yes, the two things I got from that 1% better, always like start small, do incremental pieces, and then it's a partnership, right, through the organization. That there's, in many cases, from what you're saying, Fred, that there is business benefits to just being, better organized, having better visibility, and just in general, cybersecurity could be a competitive advantage potentially, right, depending on which industry you might be in. So, all right, if you guys have, so back to the another question for you, Chris. So there's a lot of talk about that, and it seems like a lot of the interest is on programs and just kind of like practical things that folks can do to enable the zero trust and just in general cybersecurity journey. I think with Chris, that, and then afterwards, Fred, let's what give us an example of a project that went really well, and something that you've done that maybe could have gone a little bit better, right? Because not as much as we want to believe that every project's gonna be perfect, just having that sense of what went well, what didn't go well, and what could have been better. That's I think are good type of examples for folks to see that even the best have some bumps in the road. So let's start with you, Chris, and then we'll go to Fred.
I've got a project that did both simultaneously. So one of the first things I did when I joined CrossMe, one of the first things I do pretty much every organization I join is to make sure we turn on MFA in whatever directory service that we're using, Google, O365, Azure. They all support it. I think it's available on every, I'm not familiar with everyone's pricing tier, but I think it's available to everyone at this point. I know even Salesforce is pushing it out mandatory for every account now. But one of the first things I did, let's turn that on, right? Really having a good understanding of what each setting means in your environment is really critical. So we turn this on, right? We're a fast growing startup. We're hiring people very quickly. There was basically a race condition we unintentionally created in that authentication step, where if the new account had not already turned on MFA, they could not log in. So we basically prevented new users from actually being able to log in because they've never logged in to set up MFA. So we didn't have there's basically a grace period from the time the account is created and when they log in to actually set up MFA. So yeah, that attention to detail, I think that's something that, a lot of folks that might resonate with in a startup moving really quickly. You're trying to enable the business. Like Fred said, we're really in an operations role. That is our purpose. But that was a really good example of, we got MFA on for everyone, but unintentionally locked out new hires on their first day. Easy remedy, right? Very, very quick setting to change. But yeah, that attention to detail when you're moving that quickly is really critical.
Fred, do you have a good story? It doesn't have to be a JumpCloud, just, here
Chris,
in the past.
Sure, Chris, I feel like that was a easy one, but I'll dig in a little deeper. So in a time when we first started implementing MFA, MFA and password resetting and account lockouts, so not a in JumpCloud land, but in another place, one of the challenges was because there was potentially latency for doing work in different places, using something as a vehicle to allow you to have access, like an RDP connection or something like this, requiring MFA in this process continually wound up locking out accounts because of the timing difference between all of these systems. And so we had thought, hey, great, we're going to make sure that nobody can, spoof a session here. And regardless of where you come from, this makes it easier for us to do this work. And, it turns out that, that probably wasn't the best implementation of MFA, given how that system for access was manifested. What we did instead was went to the system we were accessing and brokering through, and we used browser extensions here to do more of the access control. And so that worked out better. But the challenge there was, obviously, when accessibility is the requirement for you to do work, and this has very specific needs when you do have accessibility requirements, and you don't have those, then obviously you've inhibited the business as opposed to, secured it. So good lessons to learn across the way, that sometimes the best implementation is different than the way that it should be designed from your initial your initial purview.
Awesome. So I think both of you guys brought up really great examples, and it actually opens up another question, right? Like, so zero trust we talked about earlier is a progress that has to happen, right? Like, between, you got to crawl, walk, run, and do things in various steps. So starting with you, Chris, right? Like, part of that journey also means the ability to communicate to leadership, like, what are some of the goals and milestones that you meet. So if you can talk to us a little bit about, just that sort of communication with the execs, right? Because, like, there's a tendency to say, let's go buy that magic box, put it in there, press that red button, and everything works. But just a little bit about, just that partnership over time, and what to expect, and sort of the communication with execs. And then we'll ask the same question to Fred.
So I think in a B2B startup, like I work in business to business, where we're selling to other businesses, versus someone in a business to consumer organization, really translating all that back to whatever the company goals are, right? Is this going to increase deal velocity? Is it going to increase trust with existing customers, with prospects that are in the sales pipeline? So I think really taking it all back to that, like, you don't need to go through and I try to avoid being technical at all costs, right? I don't need to talk about, this is why we're switching from this antivirus tool to this EDR tool, right? Like, they don't need to know that part. They need to understand the why of how this equates to your ARR goal for the year, how many customers you want to bring on the platform. So I think making sure you're able to put it in their language, look to your peers, right? Like, finance doesn't doesn't go down in the weeds on like how they do all the little nitty gritty accounting things. It's how much money came in, how much is recognized in your revenue. You know, it's easy to understand, right? You don't need to be a CPA to understand what your CFO is saying, and your CFO shouldn't need to be a cybersecurity expert to understand what you're saying. So I think putting a lot of time and effort into making sure you're translating that. So an example, you know, everything we've put into place since I've joined Crossbeam and at other organizations, I've mostly worked at B2B SaaS companies, is really, okay, how is this going to increase trust, right? And I look at it from the standpoint of kind of your digital curb appeal, right? Let's say you're going to buy a house, you drive by the house, the grass is a foot high, the fence is falling over, there's broken windows. You could probably assume what the inside of the house looks like. And if you're kind of digital curb appeal, like, you know, how does your SSL rating look? Are you an A or a B on SSL labs? Do you have DMARC? You know, these are basic things. Yes, it's not going to prevent a data breach, but it shows the level of maturity in that organization. And yes, like the executive team doesn't need to know what your SSL score is, but they need to know how that's going to increase trust with your customers and your customers, your peers in that customer side, right? Your cybersecurity peers that are going to be looking at your business because they need to do a security review. You're a third party. So I think that's really important to make sure that translation is happening and that everyone gets it. And you're paying really close attention. If no one's asking questions, it's just a lot of head nods. That could be an indicator that it's really not resonating, and they're just saying, yeah, I know cybersecurity is important. Yeah, we hired you because you're an expert. Yeah, go do what you think we should do, right? So I think that those are the types of things you need to be paying attention to for the executives, for your board, and even your employees too, right? This is everyone's responsibility. It's not just you in a vacuum.
And Fred, you know, it's the same to you, right? Like what are, you know, some tips on the communication side and on how to communicate progress and all that good stuff?
Well, I think there's you got to take people on the journey with you as a starting point. You know, Chris alluded to that in a number of different ways there. But the other thing I would say is that, and this isn't always easy because it is different at every place that you go, which is the, you know, curb appeal is a good analogy. But what are the things that resonate most around how the business, you know, should be concerned about what this impact has on them, right? And that is different everywhere you go. Threat model is different, you know, depending on what you decide to go do. The risk to the business is different overall, corporate risk, cyber risk, short. And then, you know, the way to think about that too is, I think oftentimes people come in and they do get a good sit rep. They sit down and sort of look around and see what's going on. They're like, okay, there is a ton of things to do. Let's go do all the things, right? And in that case, right, you sort of lost not only the, you know, the crusade you're on with any followers, but you've also gotten to a place where somebody's got to determine if you're going to implement this one thing or that one thing. And that's a difficult place to get to when you just get started on a journey like that. So I think it's important to understand and to think about, you know, come in with top three prioritized things, places to start. Do a good job there and continue to build incrementally and make sure that people understand the value of those things. I like to think in terms of a maturity model for almost anything, whether it's, you know, CMI or other things, but it's a relation to be able to draw improvement as opposed to, you know, measure output. And I think those things are different and they also calibrate better to a growing business. And it's a way to think about that in a way that the board can also resonate around that investment dollars and or business spend is going to the appropriate places to improve and grow the business.
Awesome. Hey, this has been a really great conversation. So, so there's a lot of questions, and so I think what we'll do is we'll stay on for an extra 5 minutes at the top of the hour, and so let's get to the Q&A session. But before we get there, let's talk about resources, right? So this is just a series of resources that are available. These are the links. We will send them out as part of the wrap up. You can download these on your own. There's a lot of great things there that will point you to some resources to help you get started. You know, wherever you're on the journey. After this, we'll actually add a couple more. You know, we'll put a link to NIST framework, right? Like, there's a lot of good, you know, details there that you can look at. And so with that, I want to open things up to everyone to on the call to ask questions. You know, I know we've answered some questions already. There have been some great questions, and so, you know, we've got about the next 10 minutes or so to do so. So if you got a question, throw them in the chat, and we will get to them one by one. Okay, so all right, so the way I'll do this, I'll throw this as a toss up. So Chris and Fred, you guys, either one of you can grab it. Question: is it better to consolidate MFA apps or just use, you know, so basically, should we use lots of different MFA apps, or should we just consolidate down to one MFA provider?
So I would say I would love to consolidate, but I really try to make it as accessible to our users, right? I can't assume everyone is familiar with what we're using. So a good example, like if folks want to use a YubiKey versus a Titan key, like you can use both, right? I would prefer there was, you know, one to rule them all. Like I said earlier, I've got 7 or 8 on my phone, but, you know, I have ones for my personal stuff and ones for work. Yeah, it would be great, but I try to make it as accessible as possible, so there is no barrier to entry, right? You just turn it on, use whatever app you want.
That's a great question. It also sounds like webinars, right? Like, which one do you use? A Zoom, is it Teams? You know, make it easy. Okay, so this one's for you. This one's for you, Fred. So there's a question that comes in that says, curious to hear how single sign-on plays into zero trust, and so if you could just kind of, you know, make that connection for folks.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. It's a part for sure. When we think about the discipline of authentication, authorization, and then authenticity, right? The notion of the application you're applying to and the notion of who you are two, you know, two of the primary stakeholders in that negotiation, right? And so we can think about that. If I want to get access to something, I know the method and the assertions of what is required to authenticate to it, and I know that I'm me, the same me every time, and me is this role, and so I can be applied in this way to this application. Now, that's only valid if we include things like, you know, a directory service, and we have a method for making sure that I am who I say that I am in this process, and that's where multi-factor and single sign-on converge. And this is actually the way. This is the way. I mean, this is the way forward. Yep.
I think there's compounding benefits there as well. You know, SSO definitely part of zero trust journey. You mentioned earlier, we talked a little bit about provisioning and deprovisioning. I don't believe anyone has a provisioning problem. If someone doesn't have access to something, you're going to know about it, right? Like, they're going to put a ticket, they're going to talk to their manager. No one tells you, oh, I still have access to this thing after I left. That rarely, if ever, happens. It's the deprovisioning. Single sign-on, getting that in place, I think helps immensely with the deprovisioning sign, and you're not going all to, you know, 100 different systems to deprovision someone to make sure they no longer have access, right? So I think that's a great journey to start after this call if you haven't.
Yeah, that's a oh, yeah. So I was gonna say my own experience. By my last startup, I was probably there for 5 years, and on my exit interview, I think IT found a lot of admin accounts that I didn't even know I had from, you know, being the person that set a lot of the systems up. And so it's a super great point there. One more question that came in, and Fred, sorry, I cut you off earlier. There's a question on browser isolation and how that, you know, fits in or not fit into zero trust. So maybe some color on that to help us out here.
Sure. So there's a number of things that get factored into what I would consider to be zero trust, right? Let's just take us, for example, right? We have a set of explicit extensions, browsers, applications that all sort of factor into the policy, right? And so when we think about what it means for you to have access to resources, the requirements are that you fulfill said obligations of the policy. If not, we also have the benefit of being able to remove some of those things by way of JumpCloud. But the other part of that, from a provisioning perspective, is to very clearly understand, what it means to have or require access in order to gain access to a said, set of resources. And so in this case, one of the benefits is being able to stipulate that. One of the other benefits of being able to identify you is also, I don't want to say browser fingerprinting, but certainly there are aspects of what we do when we make requests to services to be able to determine that you are, within a stone's throw of the normal things, the normal browsers, the normal relationships that you establish. And that also helps us characterize whether or not there are new things that are different and that might be concerning or not.
Awesome.
I'd add on there, I think it's from the standpoint of the vendor side, almost not internally. When you talked about browser fingerprinting, right, there's a lot of bot detection technologies out there now, like hopefully eliminating the CAPTCHAs and, me, telling Google what's a fire hydrant or not. Like, I'm not the computer. I shouldn't be the one clicking these things. But if you look at those technologies, I think it's more for the vendor side than it is for internal zero trust or internal security controls, right? I think browser isolation goes down the path of trying to prevent exploits happening, since that's now very common attack path. You hit email and then I need to break out of email, which you're usually reading email in a browser. So I think there's less of the concept we've talked about today in browser isolation for internal, but more the vendor side, I think.
All right. So another question came in is that does zero trust mean that you have to implement deny-all rules on secure networks? And so there's always a perception there, right? Like you just got to block everyone. I don't know who wants to take this. Maybe Chris. So deny-all rules, like how does that apply to zero trust, if it does or not?
Internally, I'd prefer not to have deny all. I don't want people yelling at me that they couldn't get to some slide pitch deck for some customer that they're on site with, and now it's my fault. So I'd prefer the trust but verify, which we've talked about for the last hour. When it comes to external, right, I think that still applies, right? Where your security groups, or, what is now a firewall in AWS or GCP or Azure. So I think that's where, external to internal, that stuff makes sense. Internally, I'd rather let people get their job done and let me worry about verifying you are doing what you should be doing, right?
Okay. All right. So this has been fantastic. We have one more question, and this is for both of you. So Chris or Fred, do you have any recommendation or preference in terms of passwordless domain? So I think they're asking, it's like, do you have, when you get to the passwordless domain, is there a specific, vendor or tool that you guys, both of you like? So we'll start with Fred, I guess.
Okay, all right. Well, I like YubiKey. I like Titan keys, and I would be on the lookout for more things that do this as well. But from the standpoint of what exists today, that's a good starting place. There's comfortability there for sure, and certainly done a good job so far.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I have both of them. I think it's accessible. It could be more accessible to general users and not like us folks that live and breathe tech every day. I think RSA proved that many years ago that it is can be accessible with their tokens, and YubiKey's coming out with lots of different products. But as I just said, like I have both because I need one for one system and one for another that doesn't support the other. So I think hopefully we're going down that kind of convergence path where it's going to be a little more ubiquitous. Like anyone can make their own version of a YubiKey and Titan key, and it's all following that same standard. And I can just go buy the one I want from the vendor I want, and not have to have multiple things on my keychain. But yeah, if I can't hand it to like my grandparents to use, I don't know how accessible it really is, right?
I'm into that. That's right. That's very awesome. All right. So before we wrap up, one last thing, right? So Chris has a book. We want to give it away to everyone who's on the call. So please fill out the survey. If we get more than 50 people filling out the survey, that's fantastic. We'll send them all to you where we can. So thank you everyone for the call. Thank you to the panelists for being here. I think this was a fantastic conversation. Lots of thought-provoking things. We'll be able to give you the slides and the recording of this. If you missed the call, this will be hosted on our website. Thank you, everyone, and this will end our webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please subscribe and check out more content from us.